There is a really funny thing happening in books right now, and I think it can be best described as spiritual boomerism. That is, you think things used to be a certain way, and because they used to be a certain way, that means that they are that way forever. For instance, if your boomer dad or your boomer grandpa's like, well, son, if you need a job, you need to not apply through the internet. You need to walk right into that office and show them that you've got gumption. That's the way you get a job. Look a man in the eye and shake his hand. And make sure that when the receptionist tells you that there's no jobs available, you sit down in that waiting room and you don't believe her, because employers like gumption. Jesus Christ. And yes, if you spent any time on Facebook, these people still give that advice because they still think it's 1976. In publishing, we have something similar, where we have the obscene spectacle of people pretending, despite all evidence to the contrary, despite a full 20 years of this not being the case, where they still pretend that men hold all the cards, men are the ones being published in droves, and it is women and minorities who are being excluded from publishing. At the end of April, there was a news piece touting the creation of Conduit Press, which came out and said that we are dedicated right now to signing male authors. Now, Conduit Press is a literary imprint, meaning that they are only looking for literary fiction right now. But this is big news, right? Men have been observably excluded, especially white men, from traditional publishing for years, more than a decade. However, there are people who still pretend this isn't true, including published authors. When will someone think of the men? Ha ha. Love that the white part of white men was left out, but you can still smell it. Anyway, a place for men to publish mediocre literary fiction because they've always struggled to get published. Right? Says author Gabino Iglesias. I'm not sure, but I think that's a man. A male author with an ethnic name, mind you, seems to not notice that there's not been a lot of white men specifically being picked up by publishers. Now, obviously, this isn't new to you. If you are a follower of my channel, I've made several videos talking about this. And if you looked at the copious comments from both of those videos from both authors and readers alike, you will see all of these men saying, yeah, every time I go to the bookstore, nothing is there for me. Yeah, I have been querying for years and it automatically gets thrown in the trash. And some of the agents came right out and said, we're not looking for authors like you right now. Despite all of this readily available evidence, people still cling to what is not true. And whenever I bring up the fact that these facts are not true, they always default to the same thing. Oh, Kristen, you don't know anything. You are not a traditionally published author. You're not even seeking to be. And also, Miss Ma'am, you're not a man. So what do you know? On that second part, I must agree with you. I am not a man. And you know what else I'm not? I'm not a best-selling author. I'm not a man who, upon seeing that I was not welcome in the traditionally published landscape, struck out on my own, published my own book, just one book, and boy did I publish gangbusters with my white male self. I didn't do any of that. But as it happens, a lot of you in my comments were kind enough to mention someone who did. Author Devon Eriksen shot to, I guess, Twitter fame earlier this year when he was summarily canceled by a science fiction contest that he didn't even know that he was entered into, thanks to Mrs. Eriksen, bringing a lot of eyes to his already very successful, independently published book, Theft of Fire. And when it comes to men and boys who like to read, or maybe in another life would have, Devon had a lot to say.
If you grow up eating Soylent Green, you really have no idea what a modern American grocery store is or can be like. You know, this young man has no conception of how good things were and what the world that was stolen from him looked like. And so if you're listening, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we let the boomers do this to you. I'm sorry that we didn't fight them harder. I'm trying to fix it. But, you have no idea how good things can be if we take back the institutions of our society from this ideological cancer. They're supposed to tell stories. They're supposed to entertain us. They're supposed to transmit our basic cultural values. And they have been steered away from that function. And that's why men don't read. And even if you are the sort of person who thinks I'm a fascist and wants to cancel me, you really have to look at the world and say, well, men aren't reading books. There aren't books that men enjoy. That is an objective fact. That is inarguable. So something is inarguably wrong. So I'm sorry if that offends you, but it's not me offending you. It's the universe. I'm just being honest about what's there.
So today on the Nonsense Free Editor, as much as you all love my dulcet tones, we're going to be hearing a lot from Devon today. So for those of you in the audience who didn't much care to hear from editing Auntie over here, we'll see if maybe you like publishing Uncle better. Let's get started. Hello, Shameless Writers. I'm Kristen McTiernan, the Nonsense Free Editor, here for your, at some point, weekly dose of writing and publishing wisdom. And this week we are going to be talking to Devon Eriksen, author of Theft of Fire. And I hope he doesn't mind this title, but inspirational men's figure. I really don't know any other way to describe him. And one thing that Devon is really good at, both in his books and in his online presence, specifically on Twitter, where his tweets are a thing of beauty. If you don't follow him, you should, is making sure that everybody knows that, yes, men and women are different. We're different in the way that we think, we're different in the way that we buy, and we're different in the way that we enjoy things. It's not just something I say. He says it too.
Now, this may not be popular with certain circles, and I don't care because those people already hate me. But the male and female brains are different. They just are. Look at male and female behavior. The male and female brains are different. If you take little baby chimpanzees and you give them a bunch of human toys, the boy chimpanzees will play with the trucks and the girl chimpanzees will play with the dolls. Are the chimpanzees culturally indoctrinated? I don't think so. So, no, the brains are different and they like different kinds of stories. Different kinds of stories resonate with them. But there are also female coded stories and, more than just like monster fucker porn. Oh, did I say that again? Sorry, I keep having a tongue slip when I
We are
mean
a
to say
swearing, affirming
paranormal
channel.
romance. Men aren't reading that because it doesn't mesh with the way they see reality and what feels important and exciting to them. In fact, I was discussing this with a voice actress, Emma Ray, a wonderful girl, and she was kind of helping me with an inside perspective on what women like to read. And I was doing research for, okay, how do I write from a female point of view? How do I write a female character that feels female from inside her head? And she gave me a bunch of books to read that women like. And one in particular was A Court of Thorns and Roses. And I read this book, and it was crashingly dull. It's like, I am so bored. And so, being an author and having a professional understanding of stories, I didn't stop at, I am so bored, I'm going to put this down. I said, why am I bored? What is the reason that I am bored with this when women are fascinated by it? And to a professional author who knows his trade, the word bored means this scene is not making progress on a promise that I care about. So, okay, men and women care about different things. What do the female readers care about that I don't? And I realized that for a lot of the book, to me, the main character appears to be aimlessly spinning her wheel. And I realized one of the fundamental differences between male and female stories. Men are often very much in touch with what they want. And we especially like characters who know what they want. For us, a story is about, Bob really wants something. There are these obstacles in his way. Here's how he overcomes them. That's a male story. And it has to start with Bob really wants something. Bob has to know what he wants. So all of this stuff in the middle of A Court of Thorns and Roses that seemed like this sort of meaningless wheel spinning where this character is just a leaf on the wind, is just, drifting along, carried by the stream of external events. What's going on is that she's trying to figure out what she wants, which is something that resonates very much with female readers. What do I want? You know, oh my goodness, the sexy vampire and the sexy werewolf are courting me. They're fighting over me. I feel special, but who do I want? What do I do? That resonates for women. For men, it's like, pick a goal. That might give the impression that men don't like romance. Men do. It has to be male coded. What does a male coded romance story look like? Well, I'm kind of a nerdy kid, and the girl I have a crush on won't give me the time of day. Oh no, aliens have invaded. I have to rise to the challenge and become a hero. And at the end, she realizes that, hey, I'm worth something, and we hook up. Or, twist, I realize that she didn't appreciate me, and I'm going to switch to the girl I went on the adventure with. That's a male-coded romance arc.
Part of that difference between men and women is something that frequently popped up in my comments, which I'm going to be real with you, I did not respond very well to it because I didn't know how to. And that was male commenters who found me through the algorithm. They're not authors, they don't even read, they just got recommended my video. A lot of them came into my comment section and said, look, I appreciate what you're doing, but men and boys don't need to read. We don't want to read because video games have the storytelling aspect covered. It's better for us. This whole thing of you trying to get us to read books, this is in itself female hectoring. It's not right for us. You're trying to take a female interest and foist it onto men. It gave me pause because maybe that's true. I don't know. So I asked Devon what he thought of that.
The person who sent you this comment was very young.
I suspected so.
Yeah. The person who sent you this comment is not old enough to remember a world full of books for men. He is not old enough to remember Ringworld. He's not old enough to remember Starship Troopers. He's not old enough to remember Asimov and Zelazny. He's not old enough to remember these people who wrote books for him. And so he thinks books are not for him. And yes, video games sometimes have stories in them, but the thing to understand is there's a continuum between two opposing poles. At one pole, you have a video game that is a pure gaming experience, Doom. The story is so rudimentary that it might as well not be there. Here's some demons. Shoot them. And that is a very valuable male-coded experience. Men love it, and it stimulates those, spatial centers of the brain, and it makes you smarter. When video games first came out, everybody was, oh, this rots your brain. No, it makes you smarter. Those challenges make you smarter, and that's great. But this is one biological urge that you have as a man. At the other end of the continuum is the story. And the story becomes more complex and fulfilling the more you add to it. But you can only go so far when you're having to make it an interactive experience where player choices matter. Because when player choices matter, you're making not a single thread of story, you're making a decision tree. And that is difficult, and it necessitates simpler stories. Now, bear in mind some magnificent successes have been made in video games telling stories. If some of you out there in the audience, and now I'm not speaking to you because you probably haven't done this, played Mass Effect 3. And when I played Mass Effect 3, Moradin Solus was going up the tower to to save the research project and cure the genophage. And on my playthrough, I shot him to prevent him from doing that. I put a bullet in the back of my friend's head, and it was so well written that it was so dramatically appropriate that traumatic as that moment was, heart-wrenching as that moment was, I didn't want to go back and restore a saved game and try to play it through differently because it was so dramatically appropriate. It was such a well-told story. And I think that's what people who write comments like this are keying off of. So they're definitely on to something. But let's bear in mind what happens at the end of Mass Effect 3. They got acquired by Electronic Arts. Somebody wanted to limit the budget. And so the big choice you're supposed to make at the end of Mass Effect 3 boils down to whether the colors of the energy you see in the final cutscene are red, green, or blue. Yeah. You're
Hmm.
looking at me like I'm kidding. I'm not fucking kidding. There's no punchline coming. That's the joke. They flubbed it. And they flubbed it because their budget was limited. They flubbed it because they weren't given a fair chance. They flubbed it because some executives didn't give a shit. But at the end, all of these pressures existed because it is so much more difficult to tell a complex story in an interactive medium where player choice matters. So what we need to understand is that the more linear a game is, the more it resembles a novel and the more complex and immersive the story can be. So we need games that are pure games. We need novels and movies that are pure stories. And we certainly like to have a lot of things that sort of play in the space in between. But every time you start to tell a story that is dramatic and fulfilling, you have to constrain player choice because you have to plan, and then the player has to experience that plan, so you have to railroad them a little bit. So linear in the video game industry is this kind of dismissive word because everyone wants to pretend that they don't like linear experiences. I want to be free. I want player choice. So there are trade-offs.
So, yes, stories, even in video games, do resonate. But the most important thing about stories is that they're being told by someone who cares about them. They care about the story and they care about the message that's being imparted through that story. They have to be in the hands of people who love them and know why they matter. And if we're talking about a video game corporation, that's not necessarily the case. That was also something that Beau Lamore brought up in the interview that I did over on my Substack. If you haven't read that, you simply must go over there and read it. It's important. His father's works were all about masculinity, but also sincerity in the messages of these stories. These men's stories written by men gave the next generation of men something to strive for, something to believe in. And a lot of men out there have ideas for stories, have ideas for books or graphic novels or some other kind of art that they want to make to communicate those values, to communicate those stories, but they feel like they can't. They feel like they're not welcome. They feel like they're being shooed away. And in past generations, that would have been a problem because you would have had to crawl up to the gatekeepers and say, "Pretty please, ma'am, can I come in?" But now, that's not necessarily the case, is it?
The thing to understand is that in the 20th century, you really needed a publisher. And so, because book sales were through bookstores and you needed someone to finance your printing and you needed someone who had relationships with bookstores. And you had this industry that grew up, and really in the mid to late 20th century, it usually had a pretty good idea what people wanted to read. And especially in science fiction and fantasy, which is most of what I pay attention to, most of the readers were male. It's just science fiction and fantasy was a little more male coded at the time. And so larger political forces eventually impacted the publishing industry, and you started to see these publishing houses merging and being taken over by the same set of people who all lived in the same 10-block radius in Manhattan and went to the same parties and so forth. And they had certain political ideas, and they were not really all that interested in what people wanted to read. They were very interested in what they thought people should read. And so if and when they ever had a discussion about what men want to read, there were no males in the room who could deadlift over 300 pounds. And for those of you who don't deadlift, for a healthy adult male, 300 pounds is not a particularly high number. There would be no males in that room with testosterone levels over 400.
Mhm.
And, this was almost by design because they didn't like those kind of people. And so they really didn't have any idea what men want. And they really didn't care. And so anyone who was writing things that men are interested in was kept out of the industry. And that continued for quite some time until you had men in the general population who just fell out of the habit of reading because there was nothing for them to read. Mm-hmm. There was nothing that spoke to them. What's happened now is that we have the internet, and you can have a direct relationship with your audience. You can have a direct relationship with your readers. You can market directly to them. You can speak directly to them. You can listen directly to them. You can sell directly to them. You don't need to go through these gatekeepers who have been ideologically captured. And so that was what I did, because I took one look in the mirror and realized that I wasn't the type of person who agents were interested in having relationships with. And if you go on agents' websites, they're very blatant about this. I want to publish people of this race with these sexual preferences who are writing about this. They're completely open about that. Mm-hmm. So I says, okay, I'll I'll do it myself. Why would I want to appeal to people who hate me to be allowed to do the things that I wish to do? So I wrote what I wanted to write. And I says, okay, well, I'm going to get on social media and see if anybody wants to read it. I write it because creativity is not a capability, it's a compulsion.
Mhm.
But, after that, it was like, and, maybe I'm a fairly good writer, but I think also what's going on is that the urge to read, the urge to experience stories in some form doesn't just go away if you don't feed it.
Mhm.
It's a primary instinct. It's hardwired into the human brain at a very low level. And so I think there's a lot of men, especially young men out there, who are not old enough to remember a world where there were a significant amount of books written for them, but they're still very, very hungry for books written for them. When people are wading through slop all their lives and you give them something that isn't slop, they will be very grateful and they'll think you're a genius instead of you're the first basically competent person that I've run across. I won't lie to you. It is hard. It is hard to market a book. It is hard to gather an audience. When you finish your first novel, you feel as though you've climbed a mountain and your hands are ripped up and bloody and you're exhausted and you pull yourself over the edge of the cliff and you look, and at the top of that mountain is another mountain. And that is, okay, how am I going to get anybody to read this thing? So I won't lie. It's tough. But having a publishing house doesn't make that second mountain go away. It's still there. So everyone who has ever been a successful author has climbed this second mountain. And, they're not some special magic person that you are not. They're talented, but so are you. So, it's going to be very, very tough. And some days you're going to believe you can never do it. And some days you're not going to want to get out of bed. But it can be done. And you no longer need to petition or be beholden to or work with people who hate you just because you're a dude.
The thing about the trad publishing industry is they're not in charge anymore and they hate it. That author shitting on the new publishing house dedicated to men's authors, at least for now, that's nothing more than a temper tantrum. And it is pervasive in trad pub. That's why they try to call you mediocre. That's why they try to dissuade you from doing it on your own. That's why they try to tell you that you can't do it on your own, that you can't build your own audience. And you know what? You can, because Devon did it himself. And you're probably going to enjoy this next section because one particular piece of advice that I always give authors when they're debuting their first book, uh, Devon says I'm wrong. So there's that. So, what did it look like to build that audience? Because a lot of times I tell authors, you need to start building your audience even before the book is done. You need to make sure that you build up your social media presence before then, because if they don't know who you are, then they can't buy your book because they don't know the book exists. Did you start building an audience and start marketing only after you were done writing, or what did that process kind of look like for you?
I started building an audience when I was about ready to publish, when I was releasing the book. And I only ever started getting traction a couple of months after the book was released. Some CEO said something insanely communist, and I dissected him live on Twitter. Gained about 20,000 followers overnight.
Nice.
Um, but I don't agree when you say you need to start building your audience before the book is done. Now, don't get me wrong, that's a good thing to do. I disagree with the idea that you need to do it. Books don't rot. If you write a book, it will exist forever. It's always there. People can always pick it up and read it. So you are going to have to try things to get people's attention. And the way you get people's attention is going to have to be individual to you. Everybody has a different set of capabilities and talents and resources available to them. So you're going to have to try different things until something clicks. And the thing about this try it and see approach that you need to do is you don't know when it's going to work. It's not like you can say, well, I'm 6 months away from publication. Let me pick up the phone and order, 10,000 followers on Twitter as if I were ordering a sack of potatoes. It's not predictable like that. You have to keep trying. So I will agree with you that the earlier you get started, the better. But you can take off at any time. George Martin wrote a book in 1984 called Armageddon Rag, and all the publishing houses loved it. There was a bidding war. They thought it was going to be the next big thing. It was all boomer nostalgia, and they didn't realize that their purchasing audience was Generation X, who hates boomers.
Yeah.
And nobody bought it. And for 10 years or more, I don't know exactly how long, George Martin couldn't get arrested in the publishing industry. He was exiled to being a Hollywood scriptwriter, which for a professional novelist is a huge fall from grace.
Mm-hmm.
And then he comes back with Game of Thrones. So you can take off at any time. This idea that, oh, your first novel needs to have a meteoric rise and it needs to be up and up and up forever and line must go up and you're only as good as your last book. That attitude, that perception is all from the publishing industry. It's all from TradPub. Now, if you are TradPub and you have a publishing house, especially a modern publishing house doing things the modern way with their MBAs and their spreadsheets, yeah, if your first novel doesn't take off, they'll drop you or they'll back burner you. They won't spend any marketing budget on you. They'll just sign you and see if you take off. And they will can you if you don't. They're looking for that big spike at the beginning. But as a self-published author, your income is not the spike at the beginning, if you even have one, and you don't need one.
Mm-hmm.
Your income is the plateau where that spike falls off and you have a steady trickle of book sales. And occasionally you'll do something in public like get canceled. 10 out of 10 would get canceled again. Best sales month ever. Occasionally you'll have something like that happen, and that will be a big spike, but it will also bump the average afterwards up by just a tiny bit. And that plateau, that is your forever income if your book is any good.
Mm-hmm.
If it has legs, as we say.
Mm-hmm.
And that plateau will raise up every time you publish a new book. And you will build that audience, and an audience is something that pays you again and again and again. Mm-hmm. So that is how it works. So as a self-published author, you can publish to the sound of crickets and have your first book on Amazon for a year and it's got 20 reviews. And then if you manage to catch the public eye somehow 2 years later, when you've written several other books and people like those, everybody will go back and read it. Books don't rot. So you want to try to take off as early as possible. You want to try to publicize as early as possible. But while you are alive, there is no deadline. Anytime you do something that actually ends up working, your books are there waiting to be sold.
I do always like to give a complete picture. So even for authors like Devon, who have been extremely successful, we are all at the mercy of certain forces in the market. One of those is payment processors. Another one of those is the stores, the vendors, the places other than your own website where you will be placing your book for sale. And it can be very tempting to feel like we are at the mercy of these hostile monopolies. And in some ways we are, but not necessarily. And even though it can feel like climbing a second mountain, to take a phrase from Devon, it is possible. We kind of get wrapped up in this algorithmic boost. You have that 30-day sweet spot on Amazon. If it doesn't catch on there, then it feels like your work gets buried.
Mhm.
But you have done something unique in that you have an audiobook, which of course there are a lot of audio only readers, but you
Yeah.
have decided not to put your work on Audible, which is kind of, they've got a monopoly
Mm.
on the audiobook. So can you take us through that decision and how that's working out for you?
I wouldn't quite call it a monopoly. It's a large market share. It's not quite a monopoly,
Mhm.
but it really doesn't do you any good to sell a lot of products if you're not getting paid very much money per product. See, Amazon's secret to business success is not paying authors. And I went through some computations, and you can't do the computations precisely because they won't tell you. They won't tell you how they calculate your payout. It's a certain percentage of the cost of a credit, which is insultingly low if you're not exclusive to them. It's like
Mhm.
20%. They're going to pay you 20 cents on the dollar, except they're not going to pay you 20 cents on the dollar. They're going to multiply it by a factor, a fraction.
Mhm.
How is that factor calculated? That is a trade secret, and we are not going to tell you. So basically, they send you a check, and you have no idea how the amounts in this check have been calculated or how they reflect your sales. And furthermore, for a while, and I don't know if they're still doing this, at the end they ask, well, at the end, Audible asks, well, did the customer, did you like this book? Do you want to return it? Which is a little weird because according to their contract, you don't actually buy it and you don't actually own it.
Mhm.
But do you want to return it? Well, if you do want to return it, then they rake back the entire cost from the author.
Mhm.
So you can be on Audible. And if the customers don't feel like paying you, regardless of whether they enjoyed your product or not, you can get a bill instead of a check. So I did some computation and I ended up figuring that per audiobook sale, I would get somewhere between 25 and 40 cents.
Mhm.
So, you know, and I says, well, if I sell 1,000 audiobooks in a month, I get $400. If I sell audiobooks on some other service that does an 80-20 split and allows me to set my own prices, or if I sell them on my own website where I can keep everything, then, I can make at least a couple of bucks. And ultimately, writing is a business. We chose the business because we are compelled to write. We have to write. Creativity is a compulsion, not a capability. And a lot of the time, a lot of the various aspects of the publishing industry leverage the knowledge of that to avoid paying us. But at the end of the day, we're in this business. We're doing work. We're producing a product people want. And so we have to get paid or we can't continue doing it. So, when authors are amateurs, they talk a lot about story and how to write a story that satisfies people. And, you stay interested in that. But pros talk about money.
Mm-hmm.
It is really important to be able to attach that creative urge to a technique that you are going to use to get that bag. Because otherwise you can't afford to continue doing this and you have to go back to being a software engineer
Mm-hmm.
and sitting in meetings.
Being an independent artist, no matter your medium, whether it's art, whether it's literature, whether it's graphic design, it's always an uphill battle, and there will always, always, always be haters. For those of you who are on Substack, specifically those of you who read the notes section, which is basically like their Twitter clone, you probably will have seen the horrible spectacle of all of these haters dogpiling author Glennon Doyle, who, for the record, is insufferable. I am not a fan of hers. But all she did was move her extremely large audience from whatever platform she was on before to Substack. And people went nuts, calling her names, telling her that she didn't belong on Substack, that this is for emerging voices. Like, they were so mean to her. They legit chased her off within 2 days, I think it was. 2 days. Imagine what that would feel like. Like, even if you are a big creator, even if you're successful, imagine what that would be like joining a social media / newsletter platform and being told, hey, bitch, fuck you. I would take my ball and go home too. And I'm not even that famous. And I certainly don't have thousands of paying subscribers. She did exactly what I would have done. And it was a black eye for the writers community. I hate that term because a lot of the people who claim it are insufferable. And I don't know if you know this, they actually haven't finished a book and they never will. But they sure feel empowered to, declare themselves the voice of the writers community. It was embarrassing. And I was not polite about it on the timeline. I'm going to be real with you. And given the fact that Devon has success of his own and he's very opinionated on Twitter, I figure he might have something to say about the push and pull of indie authors as competition with one another versus indie authors as support for one another. Because there does seem to be a fine line.
It depends on your genre.
Mm-hmm.
And because your genre really does determine how much you actually are in competition with each other. If you're writing monster fucker porn, excuse me, paranormal romance.
Yeah,
I meant to say paranormal romance, not monster fucker porn. That just sort of slipped out. If you're writing that, it has a high volume and it's very formulaic and it appeals to a very sort of basal urge. So almost anything will do. Your products are very, very interchangeable and your audience is a little more saturated. So if you look at romance authors who are largely women, and if they're men, they have female pen names.
mm-hmm.
You'll see very fierce competition and some very catty behavior. And that's just the nature of the genre because they are in competition with each
Mm-hmm.
other. Science fiction and fantasy, by contrast, is a hug box. Now, you do have some personality clashes between high-strung creative types. You're always going to have that. And then you do have the political weirdos who try to cancel you for being somewhat to the right of Trotsky. You have that. But overall, if you're in something like science fiction and fantasy, what happens is that if one person is successful, they tend to pull other authors along. And the reason that happens is that no one author can keep up with the demand of anybody who is interested in reading. I can publish maybe one book a year if my wife doesn't get cancer or anything like that.
Mhm.
You know, do you read one book a year? I
No.
don't read one book a year. I read a lot more than one book a year. you know, and I'm a full-time writer, so I have to write, and I'm still reading many books. So, voracious readers, your core audience will suck down books at a tremendous rate. And what that means is that you can't fill the demand. So, if Brandon Sanderson or Larry Correia or whoever, or Joe Abercrombie, sells millions or hundreds of thousands of books, what they're doing is they're creating people who are interested in reading. And then here I am. Hi. Have you tried this? So I think most science fiction and fantasy writers recognize that we compete for awards, but we don't compete for customers. We generate customers for each other. So we tend to get along pretty well. I am always interested in saying whatever I can to create more authors who write stories that work for men because it is a desert right out there right now, and I am a small puddle. I can't do it alone. I have to inspire other writers to write male coded stories because that is the vast untapped market that is out there right now. And the more writers do that, the more books they will sell and the more books I will sell, and we'll all get so rich that that we never have to worry about the future again.
If there's one thing that I took away from my very long talk, I know this video has been long, but if you could believe it, the talk that I had with him was even longer, and there was some really good stuff that I had to cut out just for time. But one thing I really loved, especially after hearing about the competition and how it can be very tough out there for indie authors, was hearing about what Devon views as his mission, what he's really doing here by being a writer.
On an individual level, I thought my mission was just to tell stories. But I realized as I started doing this that my mission was to revive the stories of Western civilization and get people telling them and reading them again. And that sounds very self-important maybe, but I can't do it alone. I'm hoping that the fact that I am actually being successful at this without needing permission from the gatekeepers, I'm hoping that will inspire other people, especially men, to take a stab at this themselves and start recreating this tradition of having stories that matter, not just for men, but for the values of Western civilization, for the belief that Western civilization is a good thing and that we're making progress and that we're going to the stars. And, you know, I'm 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 a seed. I'm a small seed, but I dream of forests. Ultimately, the money is a metric for how many people are reading and loving the stories. And I hope that hits that second level of
Mhm.
somebody reading this and saying, hey, his first novel took off and he didn't need permission. He didn't he didn't wait for someone to say, you can create, do so. He said, I can create and I will do so whether you wish it or not. And if this guy can do it, maybe I can do it. And that's what I really want to see. So, I know there's some people out there watching right now who are thinking, I would really love to just be able to tell my stories and see the reviews and know that people love them and, make my living off that and be able to pay my bills. And that would be the most satisfying life I could possibly have. And Yeah, at the top of the first mountain, there is a second mountain, and that's true, but I climbed them both, and so can you. I'm special, but I'm not that special. I'm not the only one who can do this. You have to, if this is what you want to do with your life, you have to have a stab at it. And just start. Put one foot in front of the other and move. Because at what point in the future will you be younger?
Mhm.
Even if you can't see the goal, if you just put one foot in front of the other, you have to make progress. So, if I have one message out there to people who want to be independent authors and want to be successful at that and want to have thousands or millions of people reading their story, it just boils down to do it. Butt on seat, fingers on keyboard, get going, do it, do it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, if you would like to read Theft of Fire by Devon Eriksen, I have included the link down below to Amazon. You can also buy the book directly from him at devoneriksen.com. You will have seen the URL at the bottom of the screen. And if you are an author and you are looking for editing, ghostwriting, or a marketing analysis of your completed novel, you can hit me up at nonsensefreeeditor.com. So that's all I have for you this time. Until next time, take care and write well.